The CRTC wants to know how radio, TV, and digital platforms in Canada can best meet the needs of Indigenous viewers, listeners, and content creators. Join the conversation today at crtc.gc.ca/indigenous-broadcasting.
A message from the Government of Canada.
Le CRTC veut savoir comment la radio, la télévision et les plateformes numériques au Canada peuvent mieux répondre aux besoins des spectateurs, auditeurs et créateurs de contenus autochtones. Joignez-vous à la conversation aujourd'hui au crtc.gc.ca/radiodiffusion-autochtone.
Un message du gouvernement du Canada.
Tonight on Nation to Nation, Canada's Minister of Northern Affairs says the Métis Nation of Ontario has some work to do when it comes to proving its legitimacy.
They need to sit down with First Nations and other Métis affiliates from across Canada.
BC's Minister of Addiction says hard drug users living on East Vancouver streets won't be abandoned after changes to that province's decriminalization policy.
So we actually have a lot of services for people and a lot of overdose prevention sites.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. High grocery prices across Canada have been a hot topic of conversation for more than a year now, and nowhere are prices higher than in Northern Canada. The federal government has a subsidy program called Nutrition North, which is supposed to help Canadians better afford groceries. However, a recent APTN and CBC co-investigative story found not all of the subsidy is making its way back to consumers. The Department of Northern Affairs is currently doing an evaluation of Nutrition North, and Minister of Northern Affairs Dan Vandel joins me today in Ottawa to talk about the program. Welcome back to Nation Nation, Mr. Vandel.
It's good to be here.
All right, so my understanding of the Nutrition North Act is that 100% of the subsidy is supposed to go back to consumers. In actuality, how much of that subsidy is actually making its way back to consumers?
Well, first of all, I am committed, and our government is committed to make sure that 100% of the subsidy actually goes back to Northerners, people who purchase the food. That's something we're working towards. We'll take nothing less. Of course, we know food prices are very high now. They're higher in the north than in the south, obviously. There's lots of reasons for that, and we think we have to do more to try to get ahead of that problem. It's something we take very seriously. So we are doing, of course, the reports came out from APTN and the Fifth Estate, and we are doing an internal review of Nutrition North subsidy. We also have external audits, research projects that are ongoing. Professor Galloway is one of those, but there are about 4 of them that are ongoing. I'm meeting with them regularly to talk about, none of them are concluded, to talk about where they're heading, what their preliminary findings are. And we are going to do all things necessary to make sure that 100% of the subsidy goes to consumers.
So it sounds like you're willing to concede the case, though, that at this point that's not happening, that not all of the subsidy is making its way back to consumers?
I think it's an incredibly complex issue. So, maybe a bit surprisingly, it is complex. I think there's room for improvement. And I'm basing my information on the public service that run the program, but also the work of people like Professor Galloway and others who I've already met, as well as other sources we have. I've met with Minister in the Nunavut government this week to talk about food insecurity. I think there's room for improvement. What exactly the pass-through rate is, it's to be determined, but there's room for improvement. But having said that, having spoken to at least 4 researchers, they all say that Nutrition North is a good program. They're doing some good. It could be that we need to improve the data collection, maybe the type of data we're collecting, to make sure that we ensure that the subsidy rate is passed on to consumers.
Okay, and I know you do regular evaluations as part of the program, and you're doing one right now, I think, which will be finished sometime next year.
Yes.
Been a lot of pressure on you to call a review of the program, so there's been some pretty significant questions arisen, and why not just have an external review of the program and do it that way?
Well, I think that's what's ongoing too. That's actually what's ongoing with Professor Galloway and other researchers that are externally reviewing the Nutrition North, the entire program. And it's important to note, the Nutrition North has different components to it. There is the retail subsidy, there's the Harvester Support Grant, there's the Community Foods Initiative, and there's also a research initiative where we actually fund researchers to come and do some work, do some research work on our programs or on food insecurity generally, and give us recommendations on what we can do better as a government. So we're open to collaboration, to partnership, and we're also going to do an external review once the internal review is done. We've committed to that, and we'll get it done.
Okay, so you will do it after this?
Absolutely,
Okay.
yes.
All right,
Yes.
fair enough. Okay, so I'm going to move on to something that I'm sure you've heard about. It's going on in Winnipeg later this month, and it's called Identity Summit. It's being hosted by the Manitoba Métis Federation, and the
Yes.
Chiefs of Ontario are going to be there. So, first off, what's your thoughts on this summit, and is it something that you're going to be at or will attend?
Well, I've seen some advertising for it. I don't have a lot of information on it. I know, of course, who is and who isn't Indigenous Métis is a hot topic these days because of Bill C-53 and other initiatives in different parts of the country. That's a hot topic. I think in Manitoba, the Manitoba Métis Federation have been doing tremendous work, and I think it's good to put all the information out there and let the community have a public debate on this very important issue. I think the fact that our government, since 2015, has really stepped up with a nation-to-nation relationship, government to governments, literally billions of dollars of investment for housing, for education, for child welfare, for clean water. We want to make sure that that money is being invested with the right partners. That's essential for us, co-development and finding the right partners to do good work on Indigenous issues in Canada.
Okay, and this leads, of course, to Bill C-53, and I'm sure you talked to a lot of people about it in your riding when you're back home.
Yeah.
No doubt there's people approaching you about it, but it's really the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan has now pulled out, and a lot of people are saying that the bill is dead. Is that something you think that, is it finished, and do they have to go back to the drawing board and do individual agreements with the different provinces, or what happens next?
Well, listen, that's something that's being considered now. I have a great relationship with Crown Indigenous Minister Inanda Sangri. Saskatchewan, of course, have indicated they're no longer part of Bill C-53. There's a significant court case, I think, that challenges, in Alberta, challenges Métis engagement. And, of course, there's all sorts of controversy in Ontario. So I think this is an important issue, and we need to get it right. And I think clearly Ontario Métis have more work to do. They need to sit down with First Nations and other Métis affiliates from across Canada and have these important discussions. So I'm going to work closely with Minister Inanda Sangri and the rest of Cabinet, and of course the Manitoba Métis Federation and all Métis affiliates across Canada to do the right thing when we move this forward, or not.
Now, of course, this is the question, and you're a Red River Métis person, and the Manitoba Métis Federation does not consider the Métis Nation of Ontario legitimate. What's your thoughts on that organization? On the Métis Nation of Ontario, are they a legitimate Métis organization?
Well, first of all, let me say I think the Manitoba Métis Federation, Red River Métis, do tremendous work. They've proven that time and again, including challenging the government of Canada in a favorable Supreme Court decision in 2013, which I think is extremely significant. I think the government or the Métis of Ontario have more work to do. I think they need to sit down with First Nations and with other groups in Ontario and across Canada and talk about these important issues. I'm not sure that the committee at the Committee of Indigenous Northern Affairs is the right venue for that. I think those are important discussions. They need to be had. Clearly, people are not understanding the issue all over Ontario and Canada, and there needs to be discussion.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there. I know you're on a busy schedule today, so I really appreciate you, as always, dropping by our studio, and thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Up next, we'll have Minister of Environment Stephen Guilbeault to talk about where Indigenous communities fit into the government's plans to fight climate change.
APTN Investigates delivers impactful, Indigenous-focused stories that change lives and reveal the bigger picture. On this week's show,
I'm Tamara Pimentel, the Manwin Hotel on Winnipeg's Main Street Strip. Many are calling for it to be shut down, but where are the most vulnerable supposed to go beyond the Strip?
APTN Investigates, Friday, immediately following APTN National News.
Welcome back. Indigenous communities have always taken an active interest in the environment and environmental stewardship. More recently, they have entered into a number of partnerships with the federal government to fight climate change, including First Nations Guardians. At the same time, these communities have opposed Ottawa when they think the government is on the wrong environmental track. Such is the case with the proposed nuclear waste disposal site at the Chalk River facility northwest of Ottawa. Joining me today to talk about these issues is Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Stephen Guilbeault. Welcome to Nation, Minister Guilbeault.
Thank you very much.
So I thought I would start, I know that we're just kind of talking about briefly before we got started here that there are a number of partnerships with Indigenous communities, probably too many to mention, but is there any in particular that in recent years since you've been Minister that you would like to highlight some of the work that you are doing with Indigenous communities?
Well, probably a couple of things I'd like to touch on. And first, thank you for having me on the show. You spoke about Indigenous Guardians. It's a program that the federal government, Indigenous Guardians have been around Indigenous nations for a very long time, but the federal government has clued in to this long historical role that the Indigenous people have played in 2017 with a first tranche of funding. And now we're funding Indigenous Guardians in 25% of nations in Canada. And with First Nations, we've given them the ownership of the program. The federal government funds the program. They decide which project gets funded in which community. We're not involved anymore. We're working on similar agreements with the Inuit and the Métis as the one we have with the First Nations. Conservation projects. I can't think of a conservation project that we're working on in Canada right now where Indigenous nations aren't involved. Basically, if you come to me and say, Minister, we want to do this new conservation project, and Indigenous nations aren't involved, you're wasting your time. And most of those projects, it's not just that they're involved, but most of these projects are Indigenous-led. Just before Christmas, we announced what, to my knowledge, is the world's largest Indigenous-led conservation project in the Northwest Territories, with the Northwest Territories nations, the government of the territories. To give you an idea of size, it's an area that's going to, we're finalizing the agreement, but it's going to be around 1 million square kilometer. That's 4 times the size of the United Kingdom. And we have similar projects happening in Nunavut, working on the Great Bear Sea project as well. So there are a number of these projects across the country. And if I can name a third category of collaboration between the federal government and Indigenous nation is on impact assessment of projects, of large projects. The federal government assess about 10% of projects that are brought forward on any given year. So we tend to assess larger projects and projects that are interprovincial or interterritorial in nature. And now more and more we're moving into joint impact assessment with local Indigenous communities or nations where these projects are taking place. In the last 6 months, I've approved 2 new lithium mines, one in northern Ontario, one in northern Quebec in James Bay. And both of these projects, the communities, the Indigenous communities, were involved in every step of the impact assessment, even writing parts of the conclusion of the report that was the recommendations that were made to me by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada.
All right, now I want to move on to something that's been in the news quite a bit recently, and that's the situation in Sarnia, Ontario with INEO's styrolution and of course emissions going into with benzene or higher benzene levels. But it's not just now. We've been covering this story for many years. Of course, you know that area is called Chemical Valley, and it's really involved the Amajimang First Nation there that has made numerous complaints to the provincial and federal government about the air quality there, and now it's sort of being proven what they say is true. What I know the province is involved there now, but what sort of role does the federal government have to play there in sort of rectifying that situation?
So it's largely a provincial issue, and we don't necessarily have the tools that we need federally to be able to intervene, although we are working on new, what we call volatile and organic compounds, VOCs, which benzene is one of them. So these are chemical compounds that are very damageable for human health or the environment. And we're developing new regulations that would allow the federal government to play a bigger role in this. That particular company has received 4 emergency orders from the government of Ontario in the last few years, and unfortunately nothing is happening. Now this time, to their credit, the Ontario government said, you can't reopen the plant until you've fixed those problems. Now, what do they mean by fixing the problems? So we're following this very closely. I've met with some representative from the community. My department has as well. Environment and Climate Change Canada, in collaboration with Health Canada, is also working on a local air quality monitoring program in the community, because the community, they've told us that they don't trust the data that comes and the monitoring that's done by the company. So we've deployed equipment in the community so that they can have control over air monitoring. But clearly, this is a situation that cannot be allowed to continue. Like, the company can't continue violating air quality standards on a regular basis and just get away with it.
All right, and then I'm going to move to another issue that's been in the news quite a bit, and we've covered also, is the Chalk River facility and the above ground nuclear waste facility. You know, there's been a lot of opposition from most of the First Nations around there. One does support it, but you know, from duty to consult, there's also some species at risk there as well. The eastern wolf, there's been concerns about that. But ultimately, I know it's been approved by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, but ultimately it will fall to you to approve the project, I think, in the end, if I'm not mistaken.
Actually, all things nuclear are assessed under the Impact Assessment Act of Canada, but all of the responsibilities for nuclear projects are under this act are delegated to the Minister of Natural Resources, my colleague Minister Wilkinson, and the Canadian Safety Nuclear Commission. So he, by law, he has the delegation of powers for the consultations. Impact assessment is done by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission with the impact assessment, but they report to him for these type of projects. They don't report to me. But it is the federal government.
It is, okay, my mistake. Yeah. So I guess where you come in,
the nuances of impact assessment.
Trying to figure this stuff out. But I guess where you would come in is maybe the species at risk, I suppose, with the eastern wolf. That would come through your office, right?
Well, actually, for things like species at risk, the delegation applies to the Ministry of Natural Resources as well, the delegation of power. So they're responsible for everything in terms of impact assessment.
I see. Okay. Is there? Okay. So I guess there
I'm
are
not
these
trying to say that
right.
you know, the federal government has clear regardless whether it's the Minister of the Environment, the Minister of Natural Resources. Sure. We have obligations under these federal jurisdictions. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. So where do you see your department coming in on that? Or it's still being contested, I guess, and there's concerns and things like that. So what role would you play there?
I think, beyond the implication of my ministry or not, I think many of these projects are complex, and many of these projects, you have part of the population, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous, that will be in favor, part that is against. What we're trying to do with impact assessment, listen, pretty much anything humans do has an impact on the environment. And our challenge, I think, as a society, is to try and find activities that has the least amount of impact on the environment. So if we don't do that, what's the alternative? And certainly in terms of energy, clearly we need to reduce our dependencies on fossil fuels. And it's largely going to be done through renewable energies, battery storage, clean technology. But if you look at the reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, or the International Energy Agency, both organizations, which are very authoritative in these on these subjects, say that nuclear will play a role. It won't be a dominant role to get to carbon neutrality in 2050. But nuclear will play a role. So that we're trying to, I mean, the vast majority of new electricity development in this country is renewables right now. Solar, wind, we're seeing more and more battery storage happening in the country, which is not a way of producing energy, but it's a way of storing it so that when the sun doesn't shine or where it doesn't wind, we still have access to electricity. But nuclear will play a role. It won't be, as I said, a dominant role. So we're trying to, if we don't do nuclear, then we have to continue relying on fossil fuels, which comes with their own sets of issues, both in terms of social issues. We were talking about benzene earlier and Sarnia, and obviously environmental issues, certainly climate change first and foremost.
Okay, and another issue we've covered, not recently, but was the Curl oil sands spill. Do you have any update for us on that? Or
So there is an ongoing investigation by the Enforcement Branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. The Enforcement Branch, you may think of them as really the police of the environment. They're a unit within my department that is totally independent so that there's no political meddling in their affairs. So they don't ask for my permission when they want to start an inquiry or look into a case. They don't ask for my permission to publish their results. I am kept informed, but that's all they do. They keep me informed of what they do. So there's an ongoing investigation by the Enforcement Branch. In parallel to that, and we had already started, we have what we call the Crown Indigenous Working Group on tailing ponds. So it's a number of nations, First Nations in Alberta, Métis as well, and the federal government working together to determine. So we're getting, and there's debates as to when we will get there, but we're getting to the capacity of the existing tailing ponds, and the companies are saying we need permits to expand the tailing ponds, and we're telling them there will be no permits until we find a solution. We can't just keep dumping toxic water in these very large pools that are open outside, and think that there's no impacts on the environment. And there's some relatively new science that is showing that they may not be seeping into the Athabasca River, although with Curl Mine they might. But clearly there's evaporation that's happening on these contaminated lakes, and chemical products are transported in the area through the air, and there's more scientific data that's proving that. So we need to find a solution, and the agreement we've made with the Indigenous nations is that we need to come together to an agreement on what are the solutions. And until we do that, there will be no new permits for tailing ponds. Now, obviously, we already have lots of tailing ponds in the Alberta oil sands. There was a document that was published by this joint working group, Indigenous and federal government, last summer, roughly, looking at about 12 or 14 different possibilities to clean up the tailing ponds, different alternatives, different technologies, and we're studying them together. But it is an environmental problem that has gone unchecked for too long, and we said that we couldn't, in good conscience, allow that to continue.
Okay, and I know you have to get going, but there's one last question, and I don't know how you answer it, but of course, Canada is a pretty complex federation, right? And you're the environment minister. There's a lot of provinces, and what I think a lot of Canadians see is Canadians for the most part, understand climate change as a serious issue, and they want to see it tackled, and they support these initiatives that in most of the country I'm talking. But however, often what we see is maybe the province is dropping the ball or having a government that's not interested in it, and then Canadians look, climate change doesn't stop at the provincial borders, right? They always look to the federal government to solve the problem or for that leadership there. So how do you see it maybe that we can get to a more workable relationship in Canada with the provinces so that we're on the same page, that we can stop the sort of interprovincial bickering and move on these issues? Can we move toward that maybe a bit more productive than we have been maybe in recent years?
I got to watch the hockey playoffs a little bit last night, and which is a very Canadian thing to do. Federal government and provinces bickering about something is also a national sport. Probably an equal footing with hockey, I would argue. I think beyond what we see in the news sometimes and political arguments and the grandstanding by certain premiers, there's a lot of collaboration that is happening with provinces and territories on climate change. They won't. Some of them, would never admit it publicly, but it's happening on things like how do we better prepare Canadians to face impacts of climate change? So the whole notion of adaptation, and how do we work with Indigenous nations, municipalities, provinces, and territories? That's happening. We're working on cleaning up the grid to get to a grid that will be almost carbon neutral by 2035. And yes, it's more complicated with a few jurisdictions, but by and large, it's working really well. We're working to electrify our transportation. The federal government is investing in zero-emission buses in Alberta, in Ontario, in Quebec. But there is, unfortunately, there's a handful of politicians in Canada, all conservative politicians for the most part, Pierre Poilievre, Danielle Smith, Scott Moe, who've decided to use climate change as a political wedge and to fight politically almost everything we do on climate change in the name of I'm not sure what exactly. And that's at a time where in Alberta, they're having to ration water right now because of the droughts. We're not in July. We're not in the middle of summer and scorching heat. Spring has barely begun, and they're having to ration water. I was reading this morning that they're talking about moving their fixed election date to the fall because there's too many natural catastrophes in the spring now, and they don't think it's a good time to hold elections. We've entered the era of climate change, and whether or not as a politician you want to pretend you believe in climate change or not, it's happening in your province, in your jurisdiction. So I dream of the day where we can set politics aside and figure out together how we tackle this existential crisis. And I think it's largely the case with most provinces and most premiers, but unfortunately not with all.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there, but once again, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Up next, we'll have BC Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, Jennifer Whiteside, talk about the province's decision to change course on its hard drugs decriminalization pilot program.
Hi, I'm Dennis Ward, host of Face to Face. Coming up on our next episode, I'll be sitting down with filmmaker and producer Lisa Meaches. We'll be taking a look back on her career and much more. Tune in Tuesday on APTN or listen to the Face to Face podcast. Download and subscribe on your favorite player.
Welcome back. The province of British Columbia is reversing course on a 3-year pilot project that decriminalizes possession of small amounts of hard drugs such as heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl. The pilot project is aimed at reducing deaths due to a toxic illegal drug supply, but after significant public pressure, the province decided to apply to Ottawa to recriminalize use of these drugs in public places. On Tuesday, the federal government approved the request, and joining me today to talk about the issue is BC Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, Jennifer Whiteside. Welcome to Nation to Nation, Minister Whiteside.
Thanks so much for having me.
So first, can you maybe tell our viewers a bit about what led to the BC government's decision to want to make changes to the hard drugs decriminalization program?
Sure. Well, I think as you and your viewers will be aware, we launched the decriminalization pilot project last January 2023, in conjunction with a number of partners that we had been working with to develop the exemption: law enforcement, municipalities, healthcare, and people with lived and living experience. And we had been, we had said at that time that we would be carefully monitoring the rollout and the impact of that program, because it's never been done before on this scale in Canada, and that we'd make adjustments when we needed to. And so we certainly heard from communities last summer that there were concerns about escalating public drug use, and we made some changes with Health Canada to the exemption at that time. And we knew that that it was necessary to go further, so we introduced some legislation, public use legislation, that that was designed to be very clear about where illicit drugs can be used and where they can't be used. And unfortunately, that legislation is now tied up in court for the foreseeable future, due to an injunction. And we know that people really in communities really needed us to act now. So we've worked with Health Canada to just get a further restrictions, identify further restrictions in the exemption.
So maybe just to clarify on that, so now I understand that Ottawa approved your request yesterday. So can the police actually charge people using these drugs in public places, or is that still have other loopholes to go through?
No, I mean, so the announcement yesterday and the approval from from Health Canada yesterday means that illicit drugs are once again sort of recriminalized in public spaces. The Controlled Drugs and Substances Act now applies again in all public spaces, with the exception of those spaces where people who are unhoused may be lawfully sheltering, in overdose prevention sites and drug checking sites and other sites that are healthcare sites where people are receiving care and treatment for management of substance use disorder, as well as private dwellings, so private spaces. So it essentially just really tries to draw a line between public space, beaches, parks, bus stops, business entrances, etc., on the street, but retains, importantly, I think, the notion that we really wanted to achieve with decriminalization, which is that addiction is a health matter. We need to treat it as a health matter. We need to continue to move away from criminalizing individuals who are carrying small amounts for personal use. We need to make sure we're not tying up police time going after people who are carrying amounts for personal use. We really want police resources to be dedicated to organized crime and to going after those producers and distributors of illicit drugs that are doing so much harm to vulnerable people and to our communities.
And so how bad had the situation gotten since the pilot program started? Did it just maintain the same as it was? Because obviously people were using these drugs before decriminalization. Had there really been a rise or a problem in particular areas? Like we heard like hospitals and parks, things like that. Was that really becoming a problem?
Well, one of the things that's really changed in the illicit drug supply, along with the fact that the concentrations of opioids, we had just fentanyl concentrations off the charts in the drug supply now, contaminants, terrible contaminants that drugs are cut with, that really do terrible things to people's health. Those, along with that, with that change in the illicit drug supply, we've also seen really an almost wholesale shift to people inhaling drugs rather than injecting drugs, and that's happened pretty quickly, and it's a bit of a game changer, frankly, in terms of the risks that poses to other individuals. So certainly in hospitals, for example, where our healthcare system has been dealing with and grappling with and caring for people who have addiction issues and need to use drugs for a very long time, obviously. But it's quite a different situation now, with given that the mode of ingestion is really shifted to inhalation. So that's a move that we're working to to adapt all of our services to provide care for and supports for people who need to do that. But I'd say it's hard to know. There's a number of things going on, right? We have real challenges with affordability these days. We have a housing crisis. We have a bit of a perfect storm of a number of things that are really coming down hard on some communities, and so we need to do everything that we can to make sure that everybody feels safe and supported in their communities.
Now, I guess the next question I have is, of course, a lot of the hard drug users live on the street in places like East Vancouver. Where are they supposed to go now to use?
Yeah, I mean, in a place like the downtown east side, we actually have a lot of services for people and a lot of overdose prevention sites. So there in a place like that, there are a lot of services. And again, where people are lawfully sheltering, where they're permitted to be sheltering, if they don't have stable housing, those areas are exempted from the they continue to be exempt from the CDSA.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
APTN presents a captivating journey into the heart of the North with our latest podcast, The Place That Thaws.
Some areas that used to be safe are no longer safe.
Hosted by me, Danielle Parody. Join us as we uncover the intricacies of life on a changing coast. Subscribe and listen to The Place That Thaws.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcasts at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.
Hello, I'm Rick Harp, host of APTN News Brief, a daily podcast version of the nightly broadcast of APTN National News. Available on all major podcast platforms, APTN News Brief is your quick way to hear the headlines every weekday morning. Learn more at aptnnews.ca/podcasts.